Chapter 6: Shadows of Desperation. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the barren landscape. John and Lisa drove in silence, the hum of the SUV their only companion as they conserved their energy. Each passing minute seemed to stretch into an eternity, the vast expanse around them offering no signs of civilization or reprieve. Lisa's hands trembled as she gripped the map, though it had become more of a relic than a guide. The lines and markings felt mocking, a reminder of their ill-fated decision to veer off the main road. She glanced at John, his face taut with determination masking the growing fear in his eyes. "Do you think anyone's even looking for us?" Lisa's voice broke the silence, her tone tinged with despair. John exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. "They will, eventually, but we can't rely on that. We have to keep moving, keep trying to find a way out." The SUV jolted over a rocky patch, the sudden motion rattling the water bottles in the back. The sound was a grim reminder of how few sips remained. Lisa leaned back in her seat, the heat pressing down on her like a suffocating weight. As the sun finally sank below the horizon, the temperature dropped and the Outback transformed. The once blistering sands became cold and unyielding, and the eerie stillness of the night wrapped around them like a shroud. John pulled the SUV to a stop, the engine's rumble dying out. "We'll camp here tonight," he said, stepping out into the cool air. Lisa followed, her footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. The sky above was a sprawling canvas of stars, their brilliance a stark contrast to the emptiness below. They set up their small camp with mechanical efficiency, their movements driven by muscle memory rather than hope. A flickering campfire provided a fragile circle of light, pushing back the darkness that seemed to creep closer with each passing moment. As they sat beside the fire, Lisa stared into the flames, her mind churning with thoughts of home, safety, and the life they had left behind. "Do you think we'll make it back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "We have to. We can't give up, Lisa. Not now." Her gaze met his, and for a moment they found solace in each other's determination. But as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the desert, the vastness of their situation loomed over them like a specter. Later that night, as Lisa drifted into a restless sleep, John sat awake, staring at the stars. His mind raced with plans, each one dismissed as quickly as it was formed. He knew the next day would be crucial. They had to find water, shelter, or some sign of the world they had left behind. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, its roots digging into his resolve. He glanced at Lisa, her face peaceful despite the tension in her body, and vowed silently to protect her, no matter the cost. The Outback remained silent, an indifferent witness to their struggle. And as the night wore on, the desert seemed to breathe, its vast emptiness a reminder of both their insignificance and their resilience. Chapter 7: Mirage of Hope. Dawn crept over the horizon, spilling golden light across the sands. John and Lisa packed up their camp in silence, their movements sluggish under the weight of exhaustion. The cold of the night was quickly replaced by the sun's oppressive heat, and the day stretched before them like an unending trial. "We'll head west," John said, pointing to a faint line on the map that hinted at a dried-up riverbed. "If we can find it, there might be some water left." Lisa nodded, too tired to argue. Her throat felt dry, every word a laborious effort. They climbed into the SUV, the engine sputtering to life with a mechanical groan. The vehicle crept forward, navigating the uneven terrain with increasing difficulty. The hours passed in a haze of shimmering heat. The horizon wavered, the air rippling with mirages that played cruel tricks on their weary minds. Lisa squinted into the distance, her heart leaping at the sight of what appeared to be a cluster of trees. "There!" she exclaimed, pointing ahead. "It looks like an oasis." John followed her gaze, his own heart quickening. He pressed the accelerator, the SUV kicking up a trail of dust as they surged forward. But as they drew closer, the hope in Lisa's eyes dimmed. The trees dissolved into wisps of shimmering air, their salvation nothing more than an illusion. "Damn it!" John slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his frustration boiling over. Lisa looked away, tears stinging her eyes. The silence between them grew heavy, the weight of their despair pressing down like the unrelenting sun. They stopped the car under the shadow of a rocky outcrop, seeking refuge from the heat. John retrieved the last bottle of water, carefully dividing it between them. The liquid was warm and barely enough to soothe their parched throats, but it kept them going. "We can't keep driving aimlessly," Lisa said, her voice shaky. "We need a real plan." John nodded, his mind racing for solutions. "We'll follow the sun westward. It has to lead us somewhere, a road, a station, anything." Lisa hesitated, then reached out to touch his arm. "John, if it doesn't, we need to be ready for that too." He met her gaze, the unspoken fear reflected in her eyes cutting through his own bravado. "We'll make it," he said firmly, though the doubt lingered in his heart. They pressed on, the SUV crawling over the landscape like a lifeline tethered to the faint hope of salvation. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert. And just as despair began to take hold again, they spotted something on the horizon. A structure. It was small and dilapidated, its roof sagging under years of neglect. But it was real, and the sight of it sent a surge of adrenaline through their veins. They pulled up to the building, the tires crunching over the dry earth. The structure appeared to be an old Outback station, abandoned and weathered by time. John and Lisa stepped out of the SUV, their legs trembling as they approached the door. Inside, the air was stale, but it offered a respite from the sun's merciless glare. "Look for anything, water, supplies, a map," John instructed, his voice tinged with urgency. Lisa rummaged through the remnants of the station, her fingers brushing against rusted cans and faded papers. In the corner, she found a metal drum, its lid sealed tight. She pried it open, her heart soaring as the faint scent of water reached her nose. "John, there's water!" she cried, tears streaming down her face. John rushed over, his relief palpable. The water was brackish but drinkable, and they drank sparingly, each sip a lifeline. For the first time in days, hope flickered in their hearts. As night fell, they sat inside the station, their high spirits bolstered by the discovery. The stars outside were brighter than ever, their light a reminder of the vastness of the world and their place within it. "We'll keep going tomorrow," John said, his voice steady. "We'll find our way out." Lisa nodded, her hand slipping into his. For the first time, the silence felt less daunting, the bond between them strengthened by the trials they had endured. Outside, the desert watched, its mystery still unfurling in the shadows. But for now, John and Lisa had found a small victory, a glimmer of hope to carry them through the challenges yet to come. Chapter 8: Fractured Resolve. The next morning, the station felt less like a sanctuary and more like a crumbling reminder of the Outback's indifference. The faint smell of water in the drum was gone, and the once promising oasis of their discovery seemed fleeting. John and Lisa knew they couldn't linger. "We need to head west again," John said, examining the faint markings of what looked like an old cattle trail leading out from the station. Lisa hesitated, her body still heavy with exhaustion. "What if it just takes us deeper into nowhere?" "It's a risk," John admitted, "but it's better than staying here. We've got to keep moving." They packed what little they could salvage, a few scraps of rusted metal that might help signal for rescue, the last of the water, and their fraying determination. The SUV groaned as it started, the engine laboring against the dust and heat that had seeped into its core. The trail ahead was narrow and uneven, barely visible beneath the scrub and sand. Hours passed, each bump and jolt testing their nerves and resolve. The landscape seemed unchanging, vast plains of ochre, dotted with stubborn bushes and jagged rocks. Lisa's voice broke the silence. "Do you think anyone even lives out here? It feels like we've crossed into a world that time forgot." John glanced at her, his grip tightening on the wheel. "There are people somewhere. There has to be." The confidence in his words didn't match the uncertainty in his heart. He knew the desert wasn't just a test of survival. It was a trial of the mind, slowly unraveling their hope with every mile of desolation. The afternoon sun bore down mercilessly, the air shimmering with heat. The SUV's temperature gauge edged toward the red, a silent warning of yet another threat. Then, with a sputter and a groan, the engine stalled. John cursed under his breath, slamming the steering wheel. "No, no, no, come on." Lisa closed her eyes, her fingers digging into the seat. "What now?" she whispered, her voice trembling. John stepped out, the heat hitting him like a wall. He opened the hood, only to be greeted by a plume of smoke and the acrid smell of burning oil. It's overheated, he muttered, his voice hollow. We'll have to wait for it to cool down. Lisa stepped out, shielding her eyes from the sun as she looked around. The horizon stretched endlessly, offering no shade, no reprieve. She leaned against the SUV, her breath shallow. We can't keep doing this, John. It's like the desert is swallowing us whole. He didn't respond, his mind churning with frustration and guilt. He felt the weight of every decision he had made, every turn that had brought them deeper into this wasteland. As the engine cooled, they sat together in silence, their backs against the SUV. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the sands. Lisa's voice was quiet when she finally spoke. Do you think we'll make it back to Sydney? To anything? John hesitated, the honesty of the question cutting through his defenses. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely audible, but I promise I'll do everything I can to get us out of here. Lisa nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I believe you, she said, though her voice wavered. When the engine finally cooled, they resumed their journey, the SUV limping along like a wounded animal. The desert seemed to mock their efforts, its vastness an unyielding reminder of their isolation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they saw something in the distance, a faint light, flickering like a beacon in the dark. Hope surged through them, fragile yet undeniable. Do you see that? Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. John nodded, his grip on the wheel tightening. It could be a station or a camp. They drove toward the light, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten, but as they drew closer, their hearts sank. The light wasn't a campfire or a rescue station. It was a solitary lantern, swinging from the branch of a dead tree. Lisa stared at it, her hope crumbling. What does that mean? John's jaw tightened. It means someone's been here, recently. We're not alone. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. They stopped the car, stepping out to examine the lantern. It was old but functional, its oil reservoir nearly full. Beside it, a faint trail led deeper into the wilderness. Should we follow it? Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John hesitated, his instincts warring with his desperation. It's a chance. And chances are all we've got. With the lantern lighting their path, they ventured forward, the Outback's shadows closing in around them. Each step was a gamble, the trail ahead promising either salvation or another cruel twist in their journey. The desert, ever watchful, seemed to hold its breath. Chapter 9. Into the Unknown. The lantern's warm glow swayed gently in John's hand, casting flickering shadows on the uneven ground. The trail ahead was faint, barely distinguishable from the surrounding scrub, but it was a direction, a sliver of guidance in an otherwise directionless world. Lisa walked beside him, clutching a rusted metal rod she'd found at the abandoned station. It was meant as a walking stick, but in her mind it was also a weapon. The idea of not being alone in the vast expanse was no longer comforting. It was terrifying. Do you think whoever left this lantern will be friendly? She asked, her voice hushed as though the desert itself might overhear. John glanced at her, his jaw tight. We'll hope for the best, but we'll be careful. The trail wove through a landscape that grew increasingly rugged, the flat sands giving way to rocky outcroppings and patches of dry grass. The air cooled as night deepened, the oppressive heat of the day replaced by a biting chill. After an hour of walking, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old, weather-beaten shack, its wooden planks warped by the elements. A faint light flickered inside, visible through the gaps in the walls. Lisa's grip on her makeshift weapon tightened. Do we knock? John studied the shack, his instincts on high alert. Let's see if anyone's home first. They approached cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the sandy ground. John peered through one of the cracks in the wall. Inside, a single oil lamp illuminated a sparse interior, a table, a chair, and a bed covered with a tattered blanket. But there was no sign of anyone. He motioned for Lisa to follow, and they stepped onto the creaking porch. John knocked lightly on the door. The sound echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Hello, he called out. Is anyone here? No response. Lisa exchanged a glance with John, her unease growing. Maybe it's abandoned. John hesitated, then pushed the door open. It swung inward with a groan, revealing the modest interior he had seen through the wall. The air inside was stale, but carried a faint hint of smoke out, as though the lamp had only recently been lit. They were here not long ago, John murmured, stepping inside. Lisa followed, her eyes scanning the room. On the table lay a notebook, its leather cover cracked with age. John picked it up, flipping through its yellowed pages. The writing was sparse and erratic, a mix of coordinates, cryptic notes, and fragmented thoughts. "What is it?" Lisa asked, leaning over his shoulder. John frowned, his eyes narrowing as he read aloud. "The desert speaks. It takes, it tests, and it waits. Follow the trail, trust the signs." Lisa shivered. What does that even mean? Before John could answer, a noise outside froze them both in place. It was faint but unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. John motioned for Lisa to stay quiet, his pulse quickening. He set the notebook down and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The lantern they had left outside still hung from his hand, its light illuminating the immediate area. Beyond that, the shadows stretched endlessly. "I don't see anything," he whispered, though his voice betrayed his unease. Lisa clutched the rod tightly, her knuckles white. "Maybe it's just an animal." The footsteps came again, closer this time. A shadow flickered at the edge of the lantern's glow, too large to be an animal. Lisa gasped, and John stepped away from the window, his mind racing. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice firm. Silence. Then a voice, a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You shouldn't be here." John's stomach clenched. "Who are you? We're lost. We just need help." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then the voice came again, closer this time. "The desert doesn't give help. It takes what it wants." Lisa stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. "John, let's go. We need to leave." The lantern outside suddenly flickered and went out, plunging the area into darkness. John grabbed Lisa's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We're leaving," he said, his voice tight. They stumbled out into the night, the shack looming behind them like a ghost. The trail they had followed seemed to dissolve into the shadows, leaving them disoriented. "Which way?" Lisa whispered, her breath hitching. John scanned the darkness, his heart pounding. "This way," he said, pulling her to the right. They moved quickly, the crunch of their footsteps blending with the whispers of the wind. Behind them, the shack seemed to vanish into the night, its light extinguished. But the sense of being watched remained, pressing down on them with an almost tangible weight. As they walked, the voice echoed faintly in the distance, a haunting refrain that seemed to follow them. "The desert takes what it wants." Lisa clung to John, her fear palpable. "What does it want, John? What does it want from us?" John didn't answer. He didn't know. But as the desert stretched endlessly before them, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer just lost. They were being hunted. Chapter 10, The Watchers. The chill of the desert night wrapped around John and Lisa as they moved swiftly, their breaths shallow and rapid. The oppressive silence of the outback had transformed into something alive, punctuated by faint rustles and the echo of unseen footsteps. The words from the voice, "The desert takes what it wants," hung heavily in the air, a grim omen neither of them could shake. The trail they had followed was gone, swallowed by the shifting sands. Only the stars above offered any sense of direction, though their brilliance felt distant and indifferent to the couple's plight. "We can't keep wandering in circles," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "We need a plan." John glanced at her, his face pale in the starlight. "We keep moving west. The sun rises in the east. As long as we keep heading toward where it sets, we'll find something." Lisa hesitated, then nodded, clutching the metal rod tighter as if it could ward off whatever was out there. They pressed on, their steps crunching over the hard-packed earth, the darkness around them growing heavier with every moment. The silence was broken by a sudden noise, a faint, guttural growl that sent shivers down Lisa's spine. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. John nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Stay close." The growl came again, louder this time, and closer. John felt his pulse quicken as he tightened his grip on the lantern. He swung it in an arc, its faint light casting eerie shadows across the landscape. There was nothing there. "Maybe it's just an animal," Lisa said, though her tone was far from convincing. John shook his head. "No animal stalks like this." The growling stopped, replaced by an oppressive stillness. John and Lisa exchanged a glance, their fear mirrored in each other's eyes. They quickened their pace, their footsteps crunching louder against the silence. As they climbed a small rise, They saw something ahead, a cluster of stones arranged in a deliberate circle. In the center was a pile of charred wood, the remnants of an old campfire. Someone was here, Lisa said, her voice a mix of relief and dread. John knelt beside the fire pit, running his fingers over the blackened wood. "This isn't recent," he murmured. "Whoever built this is long gone." Lisa's eyes darted around the area, her grip on the rod tightening. "Then why does it feel like we're being watched?" John stood, scanning the horizon. The feeling of being observed was undeniable, like unseen eyes boring into them from every direction. He grabbed Lisa's hand. "Let's keep moving." As they descended the rise, a flicker of movement caught Lisa's eye. She stopped abruptly, pulling John with her. "There!" she hissed, pointing to a shadow shifting in the distance. John turned, his heart pounding. He saw it too, a dark figure moving against the faint light of the stars. It was tall and lean, its movements slow and deliberate, almost inhuman. Another figure emerged beside it, then another, and another. They stood motionless, silhouetted against the horizon. Lisa's breathing quickened. "What are they?" John shook his head, his voice hoarse. "I don't know, but we're not waiting to find out." They turned and began to run, their footsteps kicking up clouds of dust. The figures didn't follow, but their presence lingered, a silent reminder that the couple was no longer alone in the vastness of the outback. The night stretched on, each step feeling heavier than the last. The chills seeped into their bones, and exhaustion clawed at their minds. Finally, they stumbled upon another outcrop of rocks, a natural shelter that offered a reprieve from the open expanse. John and Lisa collapsed inside, their breaths ragged. The fear of pursuit kept them awake, their ears straining for any sound beyond the wind. But the night remained eerily quiet, the figures on the horizon a haunting memory rather than a tangible threat. As dawn broke, its golden light spilling over the sands, Lisa turned to John. "Do you think they were real?" she asked, her voice trembling. John stared out at the horizon, his face drawn and pale. "Real or not, they're part of this place, and we need to find a way out before it takes us too." Lisa nodded, though the weight of their situation was crushing. The desert had tested their endurance, their resolve, and now their sanity. But they weren't ready to give up. Not yet. The outback watched as the sun rose higher, its vastness both beautiful and terrifying. And somewhere in the distance, the shadows shifted, waiting for their next move. Chapter 11. The Unseen Path. The rising sun brought a brief sense of relief, its warmth chasing away the chill of the desert night. But as the heat grew oppressive once more, so did the weight of John and Lisa's predicament. The figures from the night before remained an unshakable memory, a lingering presence in their minds. John tightened the straps of his pack, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We need to keep moving. If we stay here, we'll never find help." Lisa glanced around the barren landscape, her lips dry and cracked. "What if we're walking right into a trap? What if they're leading us somewhere?" John hesitated. The thought had crossed his mind, but admitting it would only deepen Lisa's fear. Instead, he shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Staying still is a death sentence. We have to move." The faint trail of disturbed sand stretched westward, faintly visible in the morning light. John and Lisa followed it, their steps heavy with exhaustion. The outback stretched endlessly before them, a harsh and unyielding expanse. By midday, their water was nearly gone, the last few drops rationed carefully. The sun blazed overhead, its unforgiving heat turning the air into a shimmering haze. Lisa stumbled, her legs trembling. "I can't," she panted, collapsing onto her knees. "I can't go any further." John crouched beside her, his hands on her shoulders. "You can," he said firmly. "We're going to find a way out of this, but we have to keep going." Lisa looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't even know if we're going the right way anymore." John's jaw tightened. He didn't know either, but giving up wasn't an option. He helped her to her feet, wrapping an arm around her for support. Together, they pushed forward, the trail ahead growing fainter with each step. As the afternoon wore on, they reached a sudden dip in the terrain. Below them lay a dry riverbed, its edges lined with brittle bushes and jagged rocks. John's heart lifted slightly. Where there had once been water, there might be traces left. "We'll check it out," he said, leading Lisa down the slope. The dry earth cracked beneath their feet, the remnants of a once flowing river, now a lifeless scar. John searched the ground, his eyes scanning for any sign of moisture. Lisa stayed close, her head turning at every sound, every shadow. The quiet was oppressive, the silence so complete it felt alive. Then she saw it, an old rusted bucket partially buried in the sand near the riverbank. She ran to it, pulling it free. Inside was a small, dented tin cup and the faint scent of stale water. "John," she called, her voice cracking with hope. He rushed to her side, examining the bucket. "It's old, but someone was here," he said. He turned to the riverbed, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a faint line in the dirt, a path worn by footsteps or wheels. "This could lead to a settlement," he said, gripping Lisa's hand. "We're not far now." The faint line led away from the riverbed, snaking toward the horizon. They followed it, their pace quickening despite their fatigue. The hope of rescue spurred them on, though the desert seemed to stretch endlessly. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the sands, they saw something in the distance, a structure silhouetted against the twilight. It was larger than the shack they had found before, its outlines solid and imposing. Lisa's breath hitched. "Do you think it's real?" John nodded, determination etched into his features. "We'll find out." They quickened their pace, the structure growing clearer with each step. It was a low, rectangular building made of concrete, its surface weathered but intact. A single window glowed faintly, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. John and Lisa approached cautiously, their hearts pounding. The building's door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. John pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The room was stark and utilitarian, with rows of shelves lining the walls. On one of the shelves sat a stack of water bottles, their plastic glinting in the lantern's light. Beside them were cans of food and a dusty radio. Lisa let out a sob of relief, rushing to the shelves. She grabbed a bottle, twisting it open and drinking deeply. John followed, his hands trembling as he reached for the radio. He turned it on, static filling the room. "Hello?" he said, his voice hoarse. "Is anyone there?" The static crackled for a moment before a voice broke through, faint but distinct. "This is Outback Rescue Station 17. Identify yourself." John's heart leaped. "We're lost. We've been stranded in the desert for days. We need help." There was a pause, then the voice replied, "Coordinates received. Stay where you are. Help is on the way." John turned to Lisa, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. "We're going to be okay." But as they settled into the room, the shadows outside seemed to shift again, and the feeling of being watched returned. The desert had brought them this far, but it wasn't ready to let them go just yet. Chapter 12: The Desert's Bargain. The static of the radio buzzed faintly in the background, a lifeline tethered to hope. Lisa sat against the wall, clutching a water bottle as if it might disappear. Her breathing was steadier now, though her eyes darted nervously to the window, watching the encroaching darkness outside. John paced the room, the relief of contact with the rescue station barely dampening his unease. The faint voice on the radio had promised help, but something about the tone, the clipped efficiency, felt strange. He couldn't shake the sense that they weren't safe yet. "How long do you think it'll take them to get here?" Lisa asked, her voice still trembling. John stopped pacing, turning to her. "They didn't say, but it shouldn't be too long. We'll be okay." Lisa nodded, though her gaze lingered on the door. The desert's vastness pressed in around them, an unseen force that seemed to hum with menace. "Do you think those figures will come back?" John hesitated. "If they wanted to hurt us, they would have done it by now," he said, though the words rang hollow in his own ears. Outside, the wind began to pick up, a low howl sweeping through the desert. The sound was eerie, almost mournful, and it set both their nerves on edge. The faint glow of the building's single lantern cast long shadows that danced across the walls. Suddenly, the radio crackled again. John rushed to it, grabbing the receiver. "Hello? Is that the rescue team?" The voice on the other end was faint, distorted by static. "You need to leave," it said, the words sharp and urgent. John froze. "What? You told us to stay here." "Not safe," the voice replied, breaking into fragments. Watching, always watching." Lisa stood, her face pale. "What do they mean, not safe? Who's watching?" Before John could respond, the lantern flickered, its light dimming. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. The faint hum of the wind outside grew louder, a keening wail that rose in intensity. Lisa grabbed John's arm. "We need to go. Now." John hesitated, torn between the promise of rescue and the growing sense of danger. He grabbed the radio and a few bottles of water, stuffing them into his pack. "Let's move," he said, his voice tight. They stepped outside, the desert cloaked in an unsettling stillness. The stars above seemed dimmer, the sky an oppressive blanket of darkness. The structure behind them loomed like a shadow, its faint glow swallowed by the night. "Which way?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking. John looked to the horizon, his instincts guiding him westward. "We keep following the trail. It has to lead somewhere." As they moved away from the building, the wind howled louder, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voices were unintelligible, their tone a mix of warning and malice. Lisa clung to John, her steps unsteady. "Do you hear that?" John nodded, his grip on her tightening. "Just keep moving. Don't look back." But the temptation was too strong. Lisa glanced over her shoulder and gasped. The figures were there again, standing just outside the building they had left. They were still and silent, their forms blending with the shadows. But this time, they weren't alone. A new figure emerged from the darkness, a towering silhouette that seemed to radiate authority. Its form was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but its presence was undeniable. The smaller figures bowed their heads as if in deference. Lisa's heart raced. "What are they?" John pulled her forward, his voice urgent. "It doesn't matter, just run." They broke into a sprint, the sand shifting beneath their feet as they fled into the night. The whispers grew louder, the words clearer now. "The desert takes what it wants. The desert gives what it must." John's mind raced. He didn't know what the voices meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of some ancient force, something beyond his understanding. As they crested a small hill, they saw a flicker of light in the distance, a campfire, real and steady. Their hearts leaped at the sight, and they ran toward it with every ounce of strength they had left. The fire was surrounded by a group of people, their faces weathered but kind. They stood as John and Lisa approached, their expressions a mix of surprise and relief. "You've made it," one of them said, stepping forward. He was an older man, his eyes sharp and knowing. "We've been waiting for you." Lisa collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God. We thought we were alone." The man knelt beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "You were never alone," he said, his voice gentle. "The desert doesn't let anyone pass without a price." John's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" The man stood, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The desert is alive. It tests you, it breaks you, and if you survive, it lets you go. But it always takes something in return." Lisa looked up at him, her face pale. "What does it take?" The man's expression darkened. "That depends on you." The group welcomed John and Lisa into their camp, offering food, water, and warmth. But as the night wore on, John couldn't shake the feeling that the desert wasn't done with them yet. The whispers still echoed in his mind, and the shadows at the edge of the firelight seemed to move with a life of their own. The desert had brought them to safety, but at what cost? And as they sat by the fire, the looming question remained. What would the Outback take in return for their survival? Chapter 13. The Desert's Price. The campfire crackled softly, its warmth a fragile comfort in the cold, consuming vastness of the Outback. Lisa sat huddled close to the flames, her hands trembling as she cradled a tin cup of water. The people surrounding them, travel-worn but alive, spoke in hushed tones, their gazes shifting uneasily to the darkness beyond the firelight. John stood slightly apart, his mind racing. The old man's words, "The desert doesn't let anyone pass without a price," echoed in his head, gnawing at his resolve. He had found safety, but the shadows lingering at the edge of his vision reminded him that it might be temporary. The old man, whose name they learned was Malcolm, approached John with a somber expression. "You're not out of this yet," he said, his voice low. John turned to him, his jaw tightening. "What do you mean? We made it here. We contacted the rescue team. Isn't that enough?" Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. "The desert doesn't work that way. It's not just a place, it's alive. It's been watching you, testing you, and now it'll claim its price." John clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's just superstition. We're exhausted." dehydrated and scared. That's all this is. Malcolm tilted his head, his weathered face calm but unyielding. Believe what you want, but when the time comes, you'll see the truth. Before John could argue further, a low whistle of wind swept through the camp, carrying with it the faint whispers that had haunted them for days. Lisa flinched, her cup rattling in her hands. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The other campers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Malcolm's expression grew grim. "It's starting." John turned to Lisa, his resolve hardening. "We need to leave. Now?" Lisa shook her head, her voice trembling. "Where would we even go? We don't have a vehicle, and the rescue team said to stay put." Malcolm stepped closer, his tone firm. "You can't run from the desert. It'll find you, no matter where you go." John glared at him. "Then what are we supposed to do? Just sit here and wait for whatever this is?" Malcolm sighed, the weight of years etched into his face. "You face it, accept its price, and you might walk away." Lisa looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "And if we don't?" Malcolm didn't answer. The silence spoke volumes. As the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, their cadence rhythmic and unsettling. The shadows beyond the firelight seemed to thicken, coalescing into shapes that moved and writhed. The other campers huddled closer to the fire, their faces pale and drawn. John and Lisa stood at the edge of the circle, their eyes locked on the darkness. Then, from the void, a figure emerged. It was one of the shadowy beings they had seen before, its form indistinct but unmistakably human in shape. It stopped just beyond the firelight, its presence radiating a cold, unnatural energy. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. "What do you want?" John demanded, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The figure tilted its head, its movement unnervingly smooth. When it spoke, its voice was a haunting blend of male and female tones, echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "The desert takes what it is owed." Lisa clung to John, her nails digging into his arm. "What does that mean?" she whispered. The figure stepped closer, the firelight flickering as if recoiling from its presence. "One of you must stay." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Lisa gasped, her grip tightening on John. "No, you can't be serious." John stepped forward, shielding Lisa with his body. "That's not happening. We've come too far. We're not leaving anyone behind." The figure's form shifted, its edges blurring as it seemed to expand and contract. "The desert has watched you. It has tested you. Only one may leave." Lisa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There has to be another way." Malcolm's voice cut through the tension, low and resigned. "There isn't. This is how it's always been." John turned to him, his anger boiling over. "You knew this would happen. Why didn't you warn us?" Malcolm met his gaze, his expression weary. "Would you have believed me?" The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at John. "The choice is yours." John's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear, anger, and desperation. He looked at Lisa, her tear-streaked face breaking his heart. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. Lisa shook her head, her voice trembling but resolute. "We can't do this. We can't let it win." The figure stepped closer, its presence pressing down on them like a physical weight. "The desert takes what it is owed," it repeated, its voice echoing in the stillness. John's breathing quickened. He felt the weight of the decision crushing him, the impossibility of the situation tearing at his resolve. Then he made a choice. He turned to Lisa, his eyes filled with determination. "Go. Take the others and find the rescue team. I'll stay." Lisa's eyes widened in horror. "No, John, you can't." "Lisa," he interrupted, his voice steady, "you've got to live, for both of us." Before she could protest further, the figure raised its arm again, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble as the shadows closed in. Lisa's screams were drowned out by the rising cacophony as the desert claimed its price. Chapter 14: The Desert's Legacy. When Lisa awoke, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. She was lying on the sand, surrounded by the other campers. John was gone. The campfire was extinguished, its ashes scattered by the wind. The shadows that had loomed so menacingly the night before were nowhere to be seen. The desert was silent once more, its vastness indifferent. Malcolm helped Lisa to her feet, his expression somber. He made the choice. Tears streamed down Lisa's face as she stared at the horizon, her heart heavy with grief. Why? Why does the desert do this? Malcolm shook his head. No one knows, but those who survive never forget. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the silence, and a rescue team emerged from the distance. Lisa watched them arrive, her mind numb. She had been saved, but the cost was one she would carry forever. As the rescue team loaded them into the vehicle, Lisa looked back at the endless sands. The desert stretched before her, vast and unyielding, a reminder of what it had taken. And as they drove away, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing on the horizon, watching her go. Chapter 15. The Unyielding Horizon. Lisa sat silently in the rescue vehicle as it rumbled across the uneven sands. The other survivors murmured among themselves, but she couldn't bring herself to join the conversation. Every bump in the road, every shadow cast by the rising sun, reminded her of John. Her hands rested in her lap, clutching the rusted metal rod she'd carried since their first night lost in the wilderness. It was the only tangible link she had to the man she'd left behind. The driver, a stoic man with sun-weathered skin, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You're lucky we found you," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Not many people make it out of this place." Lisa nodded absently, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Not all of us did." The driver's expression softened. "I'm sorry." The words did little to comfort her. She turned to Malcolm, who sat beside her, his face lined with exhaustion. "You've been out here before. You've seen what the desert does. Is he gone? For good?" Malcolm sighed, his eyes distant. "The desert doesn't just take people. It holds on to them, changes them. I don't know if he's gone, but he's not the same anymore." Lisa swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What does that mean?" Malcolm shook his head. "It's hard to explain. Some say the desert absorbs them, makes them part of itself. Maybe they become the shadows, maybe they guide others, or maybe they're just lost." The thought sent a shiver down Lisa's spine. She turned back to the window, watching the barren landscape blur past. The rising sun cast long shadows across the sand, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure standing on a distant dune. She blinked, and it was gone. The vehicle eventually reached a small outpost, a cluster of weathered buildings surrounded by fences and satellite dishes. The rescue team ushered them inside, offering food, water, and medical attention. Lisa barely registered their words as she sat in a corner, her mind a whirlwind of grief and confusion. One of the rescuers approached her, a young woman with kind eyes. "You're safe now," she said softly. "We'll get you back to civilization." Lisa looked up at her, her voice hollow. "And what about him? What about John?" The woman hesitated, her expression tinged with pity. "I'm sorry. There's nothing we can do." The words felt like a final blow, but Lisa didn't respond. She simply nodded and turned away, staring at the horizon through the outpost's dusty window. Epilogue. The desert's whisper months passed, but the memory of the Outback lingered in Lisa's mind like a haunting melody. She returned to Sydney, but life there felt hollow. The bustling city a stark contrast to the vast, unyielding desert. She avoided questions about her ordeal, offering only vague answers to reporters and friends. The truth was something she couldn't explain, not fully. Late one night, as rain pattered against her apartment window, Lisa found herself drawn to the small journal she had taken from the shack in the desert. She flipped through its pages, the cryptic notes and coordinates reigniting a spark of curiosity. "The desert speaks. It takes, it tests, and it waits," one entry read. Her fingers traced the words, and a chill ran down her spine. She closed the journal and stared out at the city lights, her reflection superimposed over the darkened streets. Somewhere out there, John was gone, but not gone. The desert had taken him, and part of her felt it was still watching her, waiting for something. One day, she promised herself, she would return, not to survive, but to understand. And in the heart of the Outback, the desert whispered on, vast and timeless, guarding its secrets and waiting for those who dared to seek them.